So as we look at the post-dead zone priority 0 RB targets, these are like round 8, round 9, round 10 guys. For me, the first names that come to mind from last year, this is where James Conner was going. This is where Leonard Fournette was going. Maybe Fournette was going a little bit later, but Tony Pollard was in this range last year. He's back in this range. Kareem Hunt was in this range last year. He's back in this range. We have Cordero Patterson has joined this range. We have, Devin Singletary had a good late season. We have guys in, ambiguous backfields, Damian Harris, Chase Edmonds, Melvin Gordon finds himself in this range. Rashad Penny, the flip side of everything you just said about Ken Walker. When you look at the ADP charts, it starts to bunch up here. Drafters know this is an area where we target running backs a little bit more. There are not as many running backs going in the dead zone this year. And so it pushes some guys down that maybe have dead zone profiles. We just talked about Miles Sanders as maybe an example of that. But as we start to get into this top area, before sort of the more late round, contingency-based plays that are really interesting, these more priority 0 RB targets, when we're coming out of this stretch of drafting a bunch of receivers, who are the names in this range that you really want to target?
And this is the group where we start to look at committees and try and figure out the least expensive way to get the most upside. So even if you have a situation where you have a backfield where the starter is in round 10 and you're thinking, okay, well, I've got a starter in round 10 and a backup right next to him, I should take the starter. But the fact that you have his backup later may be a situation where you actually want to take backup just to be getting exposure to those particular offenses at the cheapest point. But having said that, I mean, you have Devin Singletary, who's in this elite offense. Now, it hasn't been an offense that's been as favorable for running back scoring. So we do have to keep that kind of as a side note. But I mean, you have a starter who's good. And I've got a lot of extra notes on Devin Singletary on the RotoViz overtime show that we did on this year's James Conner. So I won't put all of those in here for time reasons. But you have Singletary there. And then we're kind of looking at some of these offenses like the Dolphins, like the Falcons, perhaps the Patriots. But we have situations with the Falcons where we're concerned about the overall quality of the offense and what Patterson did down the stretch last season. But he's there in that round 8 range as a starter. You have Damian Harris in that range as a starter. You have Chase Edmonds in this range as a starter. Those backfields are all very muddied. Do you like any of those guys enough to take them as opposed to take other members of the committee at 4, 5, 6 round discounts?
I would say no on those ones. In this particular range, the guys that I like more, I think, are sort of the high profile, good contingency plays, really talented players. I mentioned Tony Pollard and Kareem Hunt, I think, fit that. If Nick Chubb goes down, does Kareem Hunt get all the work? And similar to the way that we talked about how Chubb maybe doesn't, probably not. But if Kareem Hunt is there, he becomes a really valuable player, and you're getting him a lot cheaper than Chubb. I don't think his profile is substantially different necessarily going into a year. Pollard, I've talked a little bit, I don't know how much on this show, but I think people are too tied into what happened last year where everyone wanted Pollard to play more and then he wasn't playing more. The Cowboys knew was Zeke's contract. They were stuck with him through 2022. I think they had a lot of incentive to continue to play him in 2021. Hopefully he's playing well enough. Maybe it spurs an ability to move his contract in the offseason or something. This is a year where, number one, they haven't been as successful as they've wanted to be over the last few years. And number two, it's kind of writing on the wall. This is going to be his last year in Dallas. So I actually think it's quite a bit of a different year in terms of how that could play out. I don't think 2021 is necessarily going to be instructive. And so Pollard could play his way, who's also an impending free agent, by the way. Zeke isn't, but Zeke looks like he'll probably be cut out of that contract after this year. Pollard could play his way into them sort of riding him as much as they can if he just looks like the better player. I don't know if he can handle a huge workload, right? But he's been very explosive. And if he brings something, Zeke's going to still play for his pass blocking and all of that. But I just think the split could be different, right? And they made such an effort last year with Pollard. His touches per snap, for example, were really high. When they brought him on the field, they designed plays for him. They seemed to indicate last year they know they want the ball in his hands. He's explosive. He had a kick return touchdown on Thanksgiving. He did a lot of different things last year that were positive. I like him as sort of finally hitting that breakthrough workload at some point for any number of reasons, Zeke getting hurt or him just actually taking more of the work this year in 2022 rather than 2021, but we're still getting 2021 prices on him despite a good year from him. And then the other one is Ronald Jones. We talked a little bit about recently, and I didn't mention him just now, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going 4 rounds higher. It looks like Edwards-Helaire is going to have the huge advantage in the passing downs. But we talked on a recent show about, hey, there's this possibility that if Jones is just the more explosive back, and I think he is, and if he's showing that in the run game, that they'll design some screens for him. He'll be able to get at least some high-value touches. He's not going to have this great high-value touch profile like we were talking about with some of the other, top-end running backs earlier in the show. But I think he has a scenario where he can get some high-value touches, where he starts to be their green zone guy, which would be huge in the Kansas City offense. If he's a really efficient runner and he's a bigger, more powerful back than CEH, we might expect that anyway. And then if he starts to get at least some screen work and some devised passing work where he can catch maybe 2 balls a game and get 30 catches, or the equivalent of 30 catches once he's, built into this role, that would be something that would be I think a pretty big hit in the 10th round. And so he's another guy. I'm looking at more of these better offenses for running back production, I would say, when I'm looking at Cleveland and Dallas and KC.
All 3 of those teams could score a ton of points in the running game. And when you add that kind of talent with it, then the upside, especially in particular windows, it might be difficult for those backs to maintain that over the course of the season. But we saw last year just how dynamic and how much impact you can make if you time it correctly. And I mean, I'm partial to those guys who went off at the end of last year in terms of Singletary and Penny and even Sony Michel. But you can definitely make an argument that the players you just mentioned are even more talented. And so, do they have the chance to do a similar thing? I think so. You talk about Tony Pollard and how electric he is as a runner. He and Rashad Penny were the only 2 backs in football last year to average both 2.5 or more yards before contact and 3 yards after contact. You got the perfect mix there where they can make the first guy miss, they can get into the hole without it closing up, and then they can make a guy miss in the secondary, create more yardage. That's what you're looking to see from a running back, just big picture and then talent perspective. Obviously, we love Ronald Jones. How about a couple of guys who might be, or I think pretty clearly are backups, but also sort of fit this talent element? Michael Carter, maybe you want to be on both sides of that, depending on your draft, even though the New York Jets are a team that we think could still be a year away. But one of the things is it's almost better to be a year early than a year late. If you're a year early and are wrong, then the ADP reflects that. If you're a year late, then you just have to pay for the production that happened the previous year. It doesn't do anything for you. And so if the Jets do break out, we have something. Raimondry Stevenson, the other one, for me, it's so tricky to play this Patriots backfield because it's just going to be a fantasy destroying muddle, right? But both of those guys played very well as rookies. They ranked 6th and 7th in the NFL in evasion rate last year, just ahead of a couple names in Aaron Jones and Alvin Kamara that we talk about as being among the most talented backs in the NFL. Again, if we're talking about going through a hot stretch, those would be names I think where maybe they have the talent to really put up points for you for a 2 or 3 week period.
I really like that. I wanted to ask you, I'm with you on the Patriots. I wanted to ask you about Carter because we do really like Hall, but Carter was a guy who had a strong percentage of high value touches last year, had the strong receiving profile coming out of UNC where he played alongside Javonte Williams. Part of the reason Javonte Williams wasn't catching a lot of balls in college is they were using Carter as sort of the receiving back, and they go in and they add a Hall. You can kind of see that they might view Carter as more of the passing downs back. And if something were to happen to Hall, then he could be the kind of guy who shifts into a 3-down workload. Not a guarantee, but that's the way he was used in college. It's the way he was used last year. I mean, they also used him as a runner last year, but they used him enough last year in the passing game. He had 36 catches, strong rate of like high value touches per snap and things like that. However you want to cut those numbers. but it looked good in terms of what type of player he is in and of himself. Now, obviously, you have the team situation. You have Hall on the team, and you have, who knows if the Jets are even going to be that good. But that's why he's going in the 10th round. And I like the idea of betting on a guy who played well. Like you said, you're just talking about his evasion percentage. There's a lot of things in his profile that look promising when you just look at Michael Carter. As we move into sort of the contingency-based plays, the more zero RB flyer plays, who are some? I mean, we mentioned Isaiah Spiller. I think he's a really interesting rookie if he does earn that role and at least have some touchdown upside. You've talked throughout the offseason that he had a great receiving profile, didn't do well in the combine, but there's this potential, if Eckler misses time, for him to sort of consolidate both sides. Justin Jackson doesn't necessarily look likely to be back with the team. He's still a free agent. So they don't necessarily have that clear backup to the Eckler role that they seemed to have last year with Jackson. And so Spiller might be the guy that if he is working into a 1-2 punch where Eckler to miss time, that he could consolidate sort of all of the work. I've used the Kalen Ballage example a couple of times where they even did that with Kalen Ballage a couple of years ago here. So they're not entirely stuck to this, big back, small back type system. Rashad White, I mentioned, there's just so much value in the Tampa Bay backfield. Rashad White's profile fits it so perfectly. That's a guy that, I don't think I'm drafting enough. I think you want to have him everywhere. If Leonard Fournette can't hold up to a big workload again this year, and Fournette has a history of missing time, at least a little bit of time, he's getting up there in age, that would be something that could just be absolutely massive for White. We wouldn't be certain that he would get all of the work. They still have, Keyshawn Vaughn and Gio Bernard kicking around, but the way that those guys were not used last year, I think indicates, and then the draft capital put into White, I think indicates that White has to be thought of pretty favorably as a guy who could potentially step in. There's been people that have said, look, Tom Brady hates rookie running backs. Maybe that's true, but maybe Rashad White is different. His age has been sort of a knock in Dynasty, but maybe he's a little bit more advanced than some of the other rookies. There's a lot of uncertainty, right, in all these running backs, but it's a bet I think worth taking when you think about what you could win if you're right in terms of how valuable that Tampa Bay backfield can be. And then recently, Shawn, we've talked a little bit about Kenneth Gainwell, but he's another guy who had a really strong rate of high value touches last year. Good profile, worked his way back into some playing time, even into the playoffs. After kind of being benched for a period, it seemed like, but they haven't added a lot in Philadelphia. He seems like he's probably the de facto number 2 behind Miles Sanders. Good young backs, or they seem to be good young backs that I think are interesting ones. Are those guys that you're targeting? Are there other ones that you want to highlight?
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about Gainwell, so I won't go over it all again, but I'm sure it appeals to you that he led the Eagles in yards per route. He was the only guy from that group with meaningful air yards. In a situation where we wouldn't expect the backs to catch a lot of passes with Jalen Hurts there, he actually had 4.9 receiving EP as a rookie. If that were to move up a little bit and he became the starter, and there are signs that that's a possibility, there's a lot of room to beat ADP in terms of his profile. A few people that you didn't mention, we have Tyler Allgeier as maybe a little bit less expensive way to play the Falcons if things break right and he emerges probably over the second half of the season kind of as the bell cow. Now, he wasn't drafted in a place in the reality draft where that seems like the most likely outcome, but his profile could be very effective within the context of what the Atlanta Falcons specifically want to do with their running game. Another back who could be perfect for what their team is going to be like this season, Nahim Heinz. Everything that you read about the Colts, they're talking about, how do we find touches for Heinz? How do we find touches for Heinz? He's too good. He fits this offense too well. The Colts don't have a lot in the receiving game, and Matt Ryan's career trajectory, both in terms of what he's done for pass catching backs in the past and where he is now with sort of your Phillip Rivers 2.0. Heinz is a little bit tricky for me to draft because there are just some other more exciting guys there. But receiving backs, and this is one of the things that Pete said when he was on the show, is that because receiving backs underperformed last year and didn't really fulfill their part of the zero RB equation, there are some guys who are very quality pieces who just don't cost you a lot this season. I think that Heinz has to be in that conversation. Darrell Henderson, less expensive than last year, even though he more or less showed that he can do it for a stretch. And if something happens to Akers, that he would be a high scoring option for you. Again, I don't have a lot of exposure so far. And perhaps for me, because I had him on teams last year, he did well. And then, you don't get that final outcome. It's almost this very unfair psychological kind of trap that we're in with him, where it's like, yeah, we did that. He kind of scored, and then he didn't win me my league. So in the 12th round, I'm not interested.
It's one of those things where we get those anchoring, we anchor and we have those biases, whether we had the player or not. Sometimes the player's price is pushed up. You can tell by guys by drafters that had him the year before, maybe think he's a little bit better than he is. Henderson's on that level as you're describing, and I'm thinking, well, Akers fans don't like him, and even Henderson fans who had him last year don't really love him. But I think you're absolutely right. He's a great play.